Dobro večer. O sadržaju izvještaja Nezavisne međunarodne komisije za istraživanje stradanja Srba u Sarajevu u periodu 1991-1995. godina večeras govori univerzitetski profesor, sociolog, klinički psiholog Lawrence French. Profesor French je doživotni član Američkog psihološkog udruženja kao i Američkog društva za kriminologiju. Glavna područja njegovog naučnog istraživačkog rada su socijalna i krivična pravda, kao i forenzička psihologija. Naš sagovornik se nalazi u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama u gradu New Hampshire. Professor French, I hope the connections are good and that we are here and see each other well.
Right.
In your rich academic career, you have researched the phenomena of institutional and cultural discrimination and a kind of racism in Western societies, especially in the context of war conflict. What can you tell us about your knowledge on this issue when it comes to war in the Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Okay. Yes, my background in both psychology and criminology has led me to explore the relationships of between whites and the people of color in the United States and in North America, mainly American Indians, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and there's today. Currently, in the United States, there's a concern about what they call systemic racism, which is racism or biases that is embedded in the institutions. And one of my areas is that of what they call the social justice. And so what you can have is a society that claims that it's based on laws, procedural laws, but if those laws aren't distributed equally across all the parties involved, then you have a discriminatory justice. And the bias in the United States that from white supremacy has also influenced Europe. The eugenics movement of the beginning of the last century actually influenced Nazi Germany. This was a pseudoscience, but it was a justification for discrimination, for blatant discrimination. So in the Bosnian situation, my exposure was first 19 years ago at some criminology meetings in Slovenia in 2002, and then I got the impression that there was a sort of bias in Europe. So I'm going to explore that more. A bias not only to Western Europe against people of color like Africans, Asians, and Arabs, but specifically, there was three groups that seemed to be discriminated against, and that was Jews, Serbs, and Roma. So that's one of my interests, and I pursued that area. 2 years after that, the International Police Executive Symposium asked me to go and look at the new police college in Banja Luka. So this was in 2004. So I took a bus from Ljubljana through Croatia to RS, Republic of Srpska. And during that trip, I experienced the type of discord that still existed, since the end of the Bosnian War, the Dayton Accord. Of course, this was just a couple of years following the Kosovo crisis, which for all intent and purposes, extended into 2002 in Macedonia. So this was the background of my interest, and it led to two Fulbrights in Bosnia, so I could pursue this from a more academic perspective. The first Fulbright was 2009 to 2010 as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Sarajevo. And then the second one was a Fulbright specialist with the Republic of Srpska in 2016 with the Minister of Interior. And then the subsequent ones, I did participated in a psychology conference in Kosovo in 2017, and then the European Society of Criminology meetings were held at the University of Sarajevo in 2018, and then the commissions began.
Inter-ethnic and intergroup conflicts related to wars, like this one in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s, are always related to prejudice and bias and division into bad and good guys. What can you tell us on this topic in general in the case of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Okay, good. I think what's important is to articulate the framework from which we examine these types of conflicts, especially civil wars, and contemporary civil wars are rarely, they're really independent of outside influences. So they become a proxy wars to an extent, So the mechanism of looking at this is that from the perspective of who's prosecuting whom. Then that leads to the bias which ends up with who considers who's a loser and who's a winner. The problem with the adversarial judicial model, of which the ICTY was based on, is that of the United States, dating back to the Nuremberg trials, is that it promotes a winner and a loser, and there's no gray area. There's no gray area. Whereas in a civil war, there's intense feelings and divisions, and you have to look at the fact that this is not always a rational process. And so in the Bosnian War, although there were atrocities committed by all sides, we're talking about ethnic cleansing. If that's a genocidal offense, then all parties are involved, except for probably the Roma. So you have people. Everybody can talk about abuses. I mean, if a family member was exterminated, if you were forced from your home, if you were beaten, if you were put in a concentration camp in starving conditions, if you were raped, these situations occurred among all the groups, regardless if they were Bosniaks, Catholic Croats, or Orthodox Serbians, Christians. So the problem is that when you selectively adjudicate only one group, it diminishes the trauma that other people are involved in. So if you're looking only at the trauma of Bosniaks, but you're ignoring the Serbs, then you have a whole group of people where there's not going to be any resolution. And then so a fairness would be like restorative justice would be a model that would take the issues and then see how they were applied across the board to all the parties during the conflict. So you don't exempt Slovenia because they claimed they had a 10-day war. You don't exempt Croatia because of the fact that they consider themselves part of Western Europe, and they're Catholic, which is apparently more favorable than being an Orthodox Christian or a Jew or a Roma. So so they get the sympathy factor for Bosniaks, which isn't really fair for them as well, because they get this false impression. Subsequent generations get this false impression that they were deliberately attacked and that they were innocent bystanders in this horrendous conflict, which is a civil war.
According to all that has been said, I mean, you already mentioned, what is the character of conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina? You said civil or international war, according to your current knowledge?
Well, I think that my esteemed colleagues, I mean, in the commission, Rafael, the chair, Victor, my Russian colleague, and Darko, I mean, in Serbia, I mean, they presented excellent background information. I mean, far exceeds any of my knowledge. I mean, I can just bring the application of intergroup relationships, but the fact is that this was, from all intent and purposes, at the breakup, as Yugoslavia followed the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it became a natural phenomenon, and then you had parties that wanted to get involved, and apparently it could have been resolved without this type of war if it wasn't for these external geopolitical influences that had an interest in one party or the other, and so that's what led to the war. So the catalyst was probably had an international factor, but the Civil War probably was going to emerge anyway, without, after the demise, the death of Marshal Tito. So it's a complex issue. It probably became an inevitable factor to break up, but it didn't have to have the intensity of the conflict that existed.
Professor French, how were the projected narratives about civil war in Bosnia and Herzegovina formed and functioned in the context of the above-mentioned geopolitical interests, and for what purpose?
Well, I think that could have been probably better discussed if we had the panel. We had all the people involved on the panel, because, again, I would have to defer to my esteemed colleagues. I think that they're better suited to do that. They were there, and even I'm sad to say, Giuseppe, the Italian newspaper person and reporter. I mean, he had excellent recall of what happened, documentation. So I think that the narrative became one that sided one group over the other, and then whoever had the strongest support system, economic and militarily, then it was their narrative that would survive. And this is the case in all current civil wars, whether they be in Libya and any other area that's going on.
In your academic practice, as well as in reports itself, you have addressed the phenomenon of judicial bias in the context of existing judicial practice versus the social justice model and the negative effects on victims on all sides of the conflict. What is the situation on this issue in the operation of international and domestic courts? in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, I think there's sufficient evidence that came out of these commissions to show that there definitely was a bias. And of course, this has been reinforced by the fact that the United States, under the previous administrations, has pulled out of the World Court. I mean, so the United States is exempt, considers itself exempt from the World Court, and yet it had a very, very a domineering influence on the ICTY. That alone, you know, and even during the adversarial process, that alone would be a procedural error that would justify a re-examining all the cases that went before it. So for it to be fair and for people to be objective, you'd have to take each of the indictments, the items that were involved in the indictment, and then you would have to apply it across the board to all the participants. And you wouldn't just dismiss some, as they have, or minimize their sentence and then reduce those sentences further. You know, there's considerable evidence to show that this whole process should be in review, that the ICTY was very unlikely an objective process. So, and the thing is, you have to do this if you're ever going to get to the point of reconciliation. I mean, the thing about restorative justice is that you're going to bring all these issues up. You just don't focus on one group and exonerate the other group, and then come up and you allow subsequent generations to keep up the hate. You know, don't forget this, don't forget that, and then you have this very, very simplistic perspective. Well, the one that amazes me is the fact that in Mostar, the bridge, you know, because I went down to see it after it was reconstructed, but that's blamed on the Serbs. I mean, nobody talks about the fact that this was a hot and heavy war with both Tudman and the Croats, who have an interest in history as far as concentration camps and liquidating Jews, Serbs, and Roma, that they were totally exonerated, and the Bosniak. So I think you have to bring all three groups up to the same level, fully examine the different indictable events, and then let that lay where it is. And then you've got to come to some type of resolution that this was a civil war. What are the barriers to reconciliation? One of them, I think, my own personal view, is sectarianism. I mean, when I looked at the schools in Bosnia, even in Vojvodina, which was bombed, you know, after the bombing in March of 1999. There's no such thing as a public school. I mean, these schools aren't public schools. They're sectarian schools, no matter what they call them. So I think there's a lot of issues that have to be resolved. And I addressed those when I did my thing at the Republic of Srpska. And the university press published a book from that. And then after my work with the Fulbright in 09 and 10, I did another book, War, Trauma, and Its Aftermath, which explains a lot of this with my colleague, Lydia Novakovic in Serbia. So, and the thing is that you need this whole thing for clinical assessment. And that's what we worked on. I mean, this wasn't just come in and to look at the situation and to be critical, to criticize it. As a clinician, we translated the best state-of-the-art assessment tools into the Slavic language, and they're incorporated in these books. They're probably not being used because people want to continue to fuel the hate from each other, intergroup hostilities. But if you're going to treat these subsequent generations, then you've got to use some of these tools. And the one of the benefits, I think, of American psychology or North American psychology is that they're pretty heavy on objective measurements. So you can see what's going on, as against the more elusive, Socratic interviews type of, like the Freudian type of situation, where it becomes the judgment of the clinician, not necessarily based on any type of scientific model. So these models that we provided in Slavic language are some of the best and most objective scales that you have. And it looks at children and youth, adolescents, if there's any problems. It looks at people that might be suffering from traumatic stress at varying degrees. It looks at partner relationships. You know, is a family going to make it? If not, what kind of interventions do we need? So we did these types of things. And although I haven't seen, you know, the pandemic has excluded me from seeing what my colleagues have said, my esteemed colleagues, but I'd be very interested in my French colleague, Patrick, who's also worked on the trauma. The thing is, if these NGOs only work on the assumption that only Bosniaks suffered from the war, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't get the best treatment there is. I'm saying that everybody should get this treatment. That you can't say that a female Serb who was involved in a concentration camp, saw her loved ones killed, tortured, whatever, that she suffers less than anyone else. That's my point. And then a group that probably is ignored throughout the whole thing is by all the groups, is a Roma. And of course, you know, that's been addressed not so much in, I mean, it's been addressed in Croatia for them to become EU, and they have to somehow come up with some model that we don't know if it's implemented or not. And but it's where it's really addressed, as I could see, was in Macedonia, whatever they call it now, North Macedonia. But when I was there in 2009, you could tell that there was a problem there that was being still unresolved, that was stemming from the water extended in the 1999 conflict in Kosovo.
It seems to me you answered to my next question partly, but in your research and work in Commission, you also deal with the clinical tests and assessments in terms of diagnosing the level of trauma. So what can you tell us on this topic more?
Well, I think I was very fortunate to be able to clinically talk to survivors of the war when I did my Fulbright specialist in 2016. Dushin knows this because he took me to these places, and we, you know, we heard the testimony of these individuals that survived, and the thing is, the testimony, you know, victim testimony is pretty much the same. If you put the blinders on and you says, I don't know if this is a Bosniak, I don't know if this is a Croat, I don't know if this is a Serb, and you just listen, very, very similar. But people need to help, and it needs to be told. So you just can't, with the swipe of some type of political dictate, to say that, give the impression that there were no victims, no abuses among one party, and they were all directed toward another group. So the clinical assessment situation is very important. Another ones that we did that I didn't mention, that and I did these trainings. I did these trainings in Sarajevo. That's why we got all this stuff done in the Slavic language. But one of the things is that is very consistent, should be consistent, in psychiatry, should be the mental status exam. And I got to admit that I was kind of ambiguous about the quality of psychiatry in Bosnia when I was there. Psychology probably had a more discipline to it, but it was hard to tell where these people got their degrees. I mean, so you've got to have some type of standardizations, like the Bologna Accord about education, which Bosnia now is subscribing to, especially if you want people who graduate from universities like University of Banja Luka, University of Sarajevo, University of East Sarajevo, whatever. You have to have some type of standard that transcript that the people in Germany, Austria, Denmark, rest out throughout Europe would say, okay, we recognize this. This wasn't just bought because you had some political connection with someone. So there's a lot of issues that have to be resolved, but the clinical issue, although it's related to education, has to be applied to all the victims. You just can't ignore a whole group, because then that's passed on generations and generations and generations, and it becomes epidemic type of trauma. They didn't experience it directly, but their parents, their grandparents did, and then their parents grew up in a traumatized environment because things weren't being treated, things weren't discussed, and now they're the third generation who's going to carry this on. And this is it's not only is this a devastating to the individual, the persona of the individual, it has economic consequences. I mean, if people can't feel good about themselves or their family or their heritage, then they're not going to be fully contributing to society. And then that's a drag on society, and the fact that you're going to have difficulty in eventual reconciliation. And studies have done this. There was some studies have looked at this and it's promoted. They said, look, you've got to address this now, because the adolescents of this generation, they're more ambiguous and traumatized than their grandparents were when the war started. And that evidence is out there. So, and you've got to have these people work together. I did see collegial working together between Bosniaks and Croats and Orthodox Serbs at the academic level. This has to continue. They have to have consortiums. They have to have a criminal justice consortium. They have to have a clinical consortium, and they have to work with the institutions that have always had some type of good reputation, whether they be in Belgrade or they be in Zagreb. They have to work with these people and come up with some type of standards just across the board for educating the professionals, and so they can treat their own people. We can't have a society can't survive if it continues to rely on an import of people. I saw this in the judicial system in 2009, 2010. All of these people that the United States sent over as judges, I mean, I don't think they were properly screened. I mean, there was some, in my estimation, some pretty poor qualified people acting as judges, and they were supposed to be the model for Bosnia judges. I mean, so you got to have these standards. You got to have a neutral international group that says these are the standards. You just can't get somebody here because they're sympathetic. Oh, I feel sorry for this group. That's not enough. You should be objective, and you should have some type of training, and you should be able to promote that training.
As I understand, you had opportunity to meet and cooperate with the Serbian victims of war, especially women victims of war torture. So can you tell us something about their traumas in terms of discrimination, because they belong to the Serbian people, and transgenerational traumas due to the genocide of Serbs in the independent states of Croatia?
Well, I mean, again, I want to go back to the point that human suffering transcends, ethnic, racial, and sectarian boundaries. I mean, we're all pretty much put together in a similar way. So the fact is that if you do not get treatment and you don't have access to treatment, or there's no recognition that you suffered, that compounds the type of problems you have, and you carry that on. Not only do you carry that in your own heart and soul, but you propagate that to your children, your relatives, and to other people. So I think that was important. That was a very, very important effort. I'm glad it came out, and I think that was one of the things that, if anything, draws a wedge into these pseudo narratives about good guys, bad guys. As simple as that is the fact that there are human beings here who are suffering, and their suffering has been ignored because they have been stigmatized as being part of the quote-unquote bad guys.
You very often emphasize the importance of restorative justice, which, in your opinion, is the best way for the true reconciliation that society in Bosnia and Herzegovina needs so much?
Well, the thing about restorative justice, the model for restorative justice in North America comes from the indigenous groups in both Canada and United States and Mexico. And then what they did before white contact is that they didn't let these things linger. I mean, a common thing of bringing harmony. Restorative justice is bringing harmony together, back together. Society has to live harmoniously. And so you can't be overemphasizing victimization, and as for a whole group that goes beyond the group that suffered initially. So when the harmony ethos is a lot different than the Christian ethics. Notably, the adversarial model comes out of the Protestant ethic, and which has got to be some type of statement. When it goes back to ancient Catholicism as well, even before the separation of Orthodox from Roman Christians. But the thing is that what the Aboriginals did, who weren't Christians, is that they believed that there had to be harmony between earth and the heaven was the sky, Father Sky, Mother Earth. And so they used the natural thing of a calendar. Crimes, no matter how horrendous a crime was, it ended on the new year. It ended. That was it. And then the clans resolved it, not the individuals. They left it to the, okay, well, how are we gonna deal with it? How are we gonna get harmony? So then you depersonalize the victimization. So restorative justice means that somebody's got to give up this intensity, that the need that they have to hate somebody else, and to say, come together for the benefit of the group. So the Navajo still use that. They reintroduce it for certain of their offenses, and Canada does it with their Aboriginals as well, the indigenous, in certain, it's allowable. Of course, it doesn't, Canadian law and American law supersedes that, but they allow them to do that to bring harmony for certain types of offenses within the community. But at one time, that was D-law. D-law. They didn't have written laws. You had to resolve matters among yourselves, and that worked for a long time. So this thing of letting things getting out of hand and carry on that stigma forever, it takes on a life of its own. You cannot be objective. You can say, oh, I tolerate this group of people, but if you have that in the back of your mind, it's indelibly etched into your memory, and you have all these evidence of what you consider hate that you only focus on, and then you exonerate anything that happened from your own group, what we call the attribution bias. You attribute bad things mainly to the out group that isn't part of your group, and then you excuse these types of very, very similar behaviors among the members of your own group That's the attribution bias, and the confirmation bias, which leads to these narratives, negative narratives that people have about each group. So the thing is that you got to transcend that. You got to get beyond that. You got to say, this is what happened. Bring it up to the surface. This is what happened. Bing, 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 bing. If there was one group that did something that was deliberate, extraordinary, then you can come up with these charges. But for all my research and the research of my colleagues, who I really respect on these commissions, we could not find a Nazi Hitler type of dictate that people are trying to stigmatize one group over the other in the Bosnian War.
I hope that these conclusions which you reached during the research will help domestic and world public to understand the causes and consequences as well as the nature of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Professor French, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Poštovani gledalci, pratili ste još jedno izdanje emisije Sarajevski Srbi, nestali narod. Prijatno večer.